Following up from the previous slide, you notice that the behavior and along these continuums between being assertive and cooperative and so forth really is how the leader is going to be acting in regard to what they want to have done, with regard to what they were concerned about, and what their response is to it. So let's look at something a little bit different. Uh, where did we see or observe leadership styles or behaviors in previous lessons? This is in the least preferred coworker LPC scale. And here you see verbs that are identifying particular actions or or rather observations by the people being led, by the leader's peers and their management team. So here, all the way from pleasant down to being kind and unpleasant to unkind, you see there's a continuum or a varying degree of, uh, of observation of, for instance, being pleasant or unpleasant. Now, this is called a continuum, and this happens to be a continuum from 1 to 8. And the people that are being led will actually score this for the leader that is leading them. This is Fielder's contingency theory. And the way they score this is the final score, as you go through here and you circle, looking at the person that's leading you, on your opinion on whether they're pleasant or unpleasant, friendly or unfriendly, and so forth. And notice these are all observations, and they are also verbs, meaning that they're doing something to make you be aware of that behavior. So this is a behavior. And when you're talking about behavior and you look at these particular things, one thing you might want to consider is why are they behaving that way? Uh, what is motivating them? What are their concerns? And is this particular behavior in reaction to a particular circumstance? Now, looking at the Fielder's contingency theory, if the individual leader scores 57 or less, then this is called a low LPC score, and they characterize this particular leader as being more task oriented, where he's or she is dead set on getting things done. If, on the other hand, you get a score between 58 and 63 on this, it's called the middle LPC, and the individual is socially independent, self-directed, or she, and not overly concerned with the tasks or with how other people view them. So they're centered, they're purposeful, they're comfortable in what they're doing, and so they are in the middle LPC group. Uh, On the contrary of that, if they score 64 or higher, or the LPC score indicates that they're motivated by relationships. Now, when we looked at the last slide, we seen that we had dominance and influence and steadfastness, compliance on different scores on the continuum. Do you see anything on here that represents the list that we just looked at with regard to their behavior, the motives and concern and so forth? And in this particular chart, you'll see that they're combining the DISC patterns or behaviors with patterns of dominance, influence, and so forth. So they're kind of shuffling the deck here and trying to say, as an example, that if in fact a dominant high D person and with dominant secondary, their primary patterns of behavior will be more in director or driver type situation. So that's who you would expect to see there. If, on the other hand, they are in the high I with some dominance involved, dominance being separate, then they are persuader and they're promoter. So these gives you some ideas of the roles of individuals that are performing or behaving in specific manners based upon their characteristics with regard to their traits. So take a few moments, take a look at this before you go on, and kind of look and see if this makes sense to you, and if you can identify a particular individual that you've worked with or you have had work for you is involved in this. Now, here's a slide that shows the styles and temperament and their roles. A person who is dominant, the temperament style, they would be more direct, more decisive. They'd be a doer. They'd be domineering and demanding. That's not a surprise. But the type of role you would expect that particular person to be in would be as a director or an organizer, a motivator, or a pioneer. Consequently, if the individual is high on influence or an influential individual in their style, you would expect to see that they were inspirational, they would be interactive, they'd be interesting, impulsive at sometimes, and sometimes even irritating. But you would have them in a role that would be an affiliator, a persuader, an encourager, and perhaps a negotiator. If you go straight down there where the S is for steadiness or steadfastness, you'll see that their temperament style would be stable and supportive, sincere, slow, and sensitive, i.e. steadfast. The types of roles that you would expect to see them in would be in a persister, an investigator, an advisor, or strategist, somebody that can keep the helm of the ship and on the course that they expect to be. Meanwhile, if the temperament for a person who is compliant, the styles that they use are cautious, careful, conscientious, calculating, and sometimes condescending because they know the rules. The type of patterns you would expect would be that they would be a perfectionist, an analyst, cooperator, and adapter. So back to this particular slide here for understanding your basic style, I wanted to make sure you visualize that this is actually a continuum from a high degree of influence on one side based on a high degree of influence on the other. And if in fact you are highly influenced by assertiveness, you would be less cooperative because it's going to be your way, and so forth. So this can be in any value if you want, or a combination of those, as you see. And just as a reminder, we talk about behavior, or how they act, what their motives are, what they want to have done, what their concerns are, what fears they have, and then the reaction to the environment at the given time. Now this happens, this score, when I piloted this program, I and a couple of my students actually took a DISC analysis survey. And the idea here is, if you look at my score, I mean the one in the orange, you'll see that I have a higher scores in influence and steadfastness, and lower scores in dominance and compliance. Pretty well balanced there, but it's no surprise that I was a project manager. I needed to be able to perform in a lot of different situations, and consequently I had the necessary attributes and styles to help with that. We also have a fellow named Ron H. And you can see here that when he took the exam, he had a very high D. He was dominant. And then it trickled down to where he had influence, and then steadfastness and compliance trickled off from there. This particular person wanted to be in charge. And he had the attitude and the style of being the person that would organize and get things done. Meanwhile, you have a guy named Stoney here, And you can see that the high S, which was steadfastness, this person wanted to stay the course, wanted to make sure that things were going the way it was supposed to be. And also, he had a secondary high there of compliance. So, this particular person was not only looking to the future, but he was looking to make sure things were done correctly. On the other hand, he also did not necessarily have a strong suit in influential or in dominance. So that's kind of, so this is a continuum, and I encourage each of you to go ahead and take a test like this. Now remember, dominance describes the way you deal with problems and assert yourself and control situations. And as you can see, Ron would certainly be an assertive person in doing the things they want to do. Influence describes the way you deal with people, the way you communicate and relate to others. Uh, and you can see here that perhaps Ron's influence wasn't as high as his dominance, and consequently he would overwhelm people to get the things done. You have steadfastness describing your temperament. You have patience and thoughtfulness. And then compliance describes how you approach and organize activities, procedures, and responsibility. Here you would see the profiles or personality test or Strong's test, and I want to bring them up again. The Welsh Adult Intelligence Scale, WAIS, believes that the intelligence was made up of a number of different mental abilities rather than a single general intelligence factor. And have you ever had an IQ test? I know when I was growing up, that was the big thing. Everybody in grade school was tested for their IQ, and the mean or the middle ground was about 100. And this is where they determine whether or not your abilities to learn affected what it is that you're going to be able to do. The Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, MBTI, is a self-report, but it focuses on how people perceive the world and make decisions. So this is kind of their attitude and the process that they go through and their biases. It talks about four areas. It talks about introversion versus extroversion. It talks about being sensing or intuitive, thinking or feeling, or judging and perceiving. And boy, you know, those particular two-word combos there can really change how a particular person leads and also follows. There's another one called the British Psychological Raymond Cattell. That was the guy that made this one. It had 16 variables and it was affectionately called 16PF. And it was based upon statistical procedures known as factor analysis off of a questionnaire. And so he went ahead and this came up to being a personality item pool to measure particular person traits. Finally, the Minnesota Multifaceted Personality Inventory, MMPI, is a very popular one, and it looks at your personality traits as well as your psychological traits to determine if you have mental issues, if in fact you're unable to resolve particular nuances between psychopathology and personality. And finally, the Strong's Interest Inventory has been used in schools for a very long time. It was developed back in 1927 by Edward Kellogg Strong, and it's helped to people to when they were getting in the military to find a suitable job. Now, I actually took these tests. I'm a veteran of 23 years in the service. And when I got in, they tested me to see what my aptitude was and what my interests were. And then they put me, regardless of that, they put me in the role that they wanted me to be in. I'm a little tongue in cheek there, but not everybody that goes into the military gets the job that they would particularly like. I, on the other hand, had a very productive career and was blessed to have work that was most interesting to me. And finally, this is used at the high school and college student levels, and sometimes adults, to determine what the strong interests they have, and so that they can have an easier time to determine what type of career path that they would be going into. Now, the next thing that we're going to be going into is called emotional EQ, or emotional intelligence, and we'll take care of that in the next video.